thanks to everyone who has joined the presentation. Tonight, I'm going to introduce you to Audubon Park, which refers to two distinctly different neighborhoods in northern Manhattan that have occupied almost the exact same footprint. The first was a 19th century suburban enclave comprising a dozen villas set among forest trees, gardens, and winding drives, and the other is a 21st century historic district comprising an urban streetscape of 19 Beaux-Arts apartment buildings and a unique double house. But before I go into any details, let me orient you where we are in Manhattan. On the left, you see a map of Manhattan. At the bottom, you can see the Empire State Building, and then in the middle, you can see Central Park, and above there, you have Harlem. And at 155th Street, that is the lower boundary of Audubon Park. On the right, you see the interlocking Audubon Terrace and Audubon Park historic districts. They stretch from 155th Street on the southern side up to 158th Street on the northern side, and then over to Riverside Drive and the river. Audubon Park is named for the naturalist, painter, and writer John James Audubon, and it evolved from a 14-acre farm that he bought in 1841. He named it Minnie's Land in honor of his wife Lucy, who you see there on the left side of the screen. Lucy's name, of course, was not Minnie, but her sons began calling her that when they were in Scotland. Minnie is a Scottish diminutive for mother. And so when Audubon bought this property, he deeded it to Lucy, both for sentimental reasons, because she had supported him throughout his career, and for financial reasons, because according to law in the 19th century, if he went bankrupt, which he had done early in his career, he wouldn't lose the farm because it belonged to his wife. It was in her name. But as they began calling the property Minnie's Land, that became the name, the official name of the farm. On the side, you see also their two sons, elder son Victor and their younger son John. This was the core of the Audubon family. It was also the workforce for the works The Birds of America and later the quadrupeds of Northern America. The younger son, John, designed the house and oversaw its construction while laying out orchards and gardens and preparing the ground for crops, building enclosures for farm animals. When all of this was ready in April 1842, the family moved to Minnie's Land. Although they were about 10 miles from the city in lower Manhattan, they had their horses, their carriages, other means of transportation, and they traveled back and forth frequently, including to an office that Audubon had in lower Manhattan. That's where he managed, again, the family business of producing and selling the birds and the quadrupeds. The first few years in Minnie's Land were idyllic. Audubon continued selling subscriptions to the books and began production of the quadrupeds. Victor, the elder son, managed the family business in the office and painted backgrounds for the quadrupeds. John, the younger son, managed the farm and painted when needed. And Lucy oversaw the household, which included John's wife, Caroline, Victor's wife, Georgina, and an increasing number of grandchildren. Eventually, 14 of their grandchildren survived infancy, and they all at one time lived in that one house that you see there, both on the left and the right in those two depictions. By the mid-1850s, however, Audubon's health began to fail and the family roles shifted. Victor took on more responsibility for traveling and selling subscriptions. John took over office management, painted when he could, but that meant he farmed less. Despite Victor and John's best efforts at keeping the family afloat, including a couple of ill-timed business ventures, by the time Audubon died in January of 1851, the family was up against hard times financially. The only fungible asset they really had left was their land, that 14 acres, which had expanded to about 20 acres with some purchases during the early 1840s. So, even before Audubon had died, Victor came up with a plan to salvage the family finances. He was going to sell the eastern portion of Minnie's Land and with the fund build some houses to lease for steady income. With improved transportation to the city in lower Manhattan via the newly opened Hudson River Railroad, which you can see there on both maps on the left-hand side, The transportation was better and opened up the new Minnie's land to the businessmen who were the practical and the most practical for a targeted audience for Minnie's land, the merchant class, the banking class. Since they had their own horses and carriages, they could travel back and forth when they wanted. But again, they had the Hudson River Railroad they could depend on if the weather wasn't satisfactory for going back and forth in their horses and carriages. Within weeks of Audubon's death, Victor had put the plan into action, and within 3 years, the Audubon Farm Minnie's land, which you can see in that map there on the left, had evolved into suburban Audubon Park, which you can see in the map on the right. And you can also see some of the houses. The one at the top is the Audubon homestead, and then the two, the one in the middle and the one at the bottom, are houses that they built. The one at the bottom looks slightly different because during the 1870s it gained a mansard roof. It originally looked much more like that Italianate style of the Audubon house, which is the top picture there. Dramatic though this transition was, it did not solve the financial problems. They had one problem was keeping people in the houses, keeping them leased. Another was that the amount of money that they got from the leases didn't necessarily cover all of the expenses of insurance, mortgages, taxes, and maintenance on the houses. Plus, several of the men who came didn't want to lease, they wanted to buy. And so they were buying their portions, which shortened, made less the amount of land that the Audubons had there in Audubon Park. In the mid 1850s, Victor had an accident which made him bedridden. He hurt his back, and he was in bed from about 1855 until his death in 1860. John, the younger brother, soldiered on, looking after his mother, his wife and children, Victor's family, and everyone else, all of the servants there. But he also died in 1862, leaving the three widows to fend for themselves. Had they been able to combine forces, Lucy and her two daughters in law might have remained in Audubon Park, but they had personality clashes and that didn't work out. So in 1864, Lucy Audubon and John's widow Caroline both sold what remained of their property and left. Victor's widow lasted until 1879, and then she also sold her property and left. Long before that, though, long before 1879, another Audubon Park resident had begun accumulating a great deal of property. That was George Blake Grinnell, whom you see there on the right side of the screen. He first came to Audubon Park in 1857 when he took a 3-year lease on a house that his business partner Wellington Clapp owned. In 1860, when the lease was up, Grinnell moved his family to a house that Victor Audubon's widow owned, and then he bought it in 1864. It was called the Hemlocks, and you see it there on the left. Again, this is a later picture. This is from the 1890s. By this time, Grinnell had added several wings and a mansard roof to the house, so it looks very little like it did when he moved in. However, over the years, buying houses and pieces of property as they became available, it took about 20 years, but Grinnell eventually owned about 2/3 of the property in Audubon Park, which he and his wife Helen left to their children when they died within a few years of each other in the early 1890s. The 5 Grinnell heirs, the children, found themselves in a situation not unlike that the Audubons had been back in the 1850s. They had lots of property, they had lots of houses, but they were not generating sufficient income to pay for taxes, insurance, mortgage payments, and upkeep. So at the end of the decade, they developed an exit strategy. They knew that the New York subway was going to reach into Upper Manhattan, so they decided that they must have a station at the edge of Audubon Park. And with plans afoot for an extension of Riverside Drive, they maneuvered to have it also cross Audubon Park, giving themselves an address on one of New York City's most desirable streets. Both of these goals required a lot of coordination and alliances with like-minded neighbors and their political connections, but they managed actually to work over the period of several years to achieve these goals, and in fact, they did. In 1904, October 1904, when the subway opened from lower Manhattan through all of Manhattan and up into northern Manhattan, a station sat at 157th Street in the midst of what had once been the Grinnell's vegetable garden. You can see there the road in the center is Broadway. The one going off to the left is the Boulevard Lafayette, which was later absorbed into Riverside Drive. But there on either side of Broadway, you can see the kiosks, the very ornamental kiosk that led into the subway stairs going down beneath. The church there is the Church of the Intercession. That was actually begun by the Audubons and other families back in 1847. It originally sat at Amsterdam Avenue at about 151st Street. In 1873, it moved to its second location there at 158th Street and Broadway, which was right on the edge of Audubon Park. You can't see much of it at the moment, but Audubon Park stretches over to the left-hand side and out of the picture on the left. Anyway, the church had become sort of a family church for the Grinnells and other families in Audubon Park. And so they maneuvered to make sure that when a new church was built, it was very convenient for them. They only had to walk up the street to get to it. The other prong of the Grinnell family's plan for leaving Audubon Park, their exit strategy, had to do with Riverside Drive. Riverside Drive ended at Grant's tomb back in the early 1900s, actually 1800s, and everybody complained that it didn't go anywhere. So after much planning at the city level, it finally the plans came to fruition for it to be extended all the way up to the top of the island. Logically, Riverside Drive should have gone along the river, not through Audubon Park. But with their particular connections, the Grinnells were able to swing it, so to speak, so that you can see in the map there when Riverside Drive opened in 1910, it actually did cross Audubon Park. By the time it opened, however, the Grinnell family had already left. In 1904, they sold a large parcel of property on the south of Audubon Park to Archer Huntington, who began building the first of several museums that would make up his Acropolis on the hill. The first was the Hispanic Society, excuse me, which is still there in Audubon Terrace, the museum complex. The second was the Numismatic Society, which has since left. Others that were there were the American Geographical Society, the American Indian Museum. They have also both left, and the American Society of Arts and Letters, which is still there. So there's still all of the buildings that Huntington had built are still there, but some of them are occupied by different organizations, institutions than they were originally. So that was the first part of the Grinnells selling off of their property. The second part began around 1908 when they sold the remainder of their land to speculative builders who covered it with multi-story apartment buildings that increased the population density several hundredfold. Whereas before you had had about 12 villas with one family each, now you have 19 different apartment buildings. Well, actually, originally there were 12, and then there were others added later in the 1920s and 30s. But each one of those, on each floor of those, were the same number of people or families who had been living in Audubon Park back between 1850 and 1900. When the last of those buildings was completed, which was in 1914, on the corner of Riverside Drive and 155th Street, by then the name Audubon Park had pretty much sunk into oblivion. It just wasn't used much anymore. The area that had been a suburban Audubon Park was now part of the city. It had been urbanized, and that name just sank into oblivion. Before I leave this slide, I'll point out that the three buildings you see there are all buildings that are in the Audubon Park neighborhood, the Riviera, the Grinnell, and there at the bottom, Audubon Hall. Each of those is again in that Beaux-Arts style. They, as you can see, are multi-story apartment buildings, very ornate. These are early pictures. Later, I'll show you some pictures of what they look like now. But just to give you a sense of what that change was from the houses, the villas that you saw on earlier slides, to these large apartment buildings that began to take up all of this space after the turn of the 20th century. Excuse me. Moving on. So the one remnant of Audubon Park lived on after all of this change took place, this urbanization. And that was the three Audubon houses that had been built back in the 1840s and the 50s. They were doomed, however, by the path of Riverside Drive. You can see there in the picture Riverside Drive coming up on the left. You see Trinity Cemetery. It crosses on a viaduct on the left-hand side of the cemetery, and then it made that dramatic turn and went through Audubon Park, joined the Boulevard Lafayette, which became Riverside Drive, and went on up. However, from the beginning, once that had been built, people complained about it. Vehicles complained, drivers of vehicles complained because they had to slow down to make that turn and then for those turns through Audubon Park. Pedestrians complained because they thought the vehicles were going too fast. They couldn't see them because of the turns in the road. Even the cyclists complained because they thought it was a sort of unusual route for them to have to take. So the city began making plans for how to fix this. It took about 2 decades, but eventually they built that new Riverside Drive that goes straight up. And this picture was taken in 1928, shortly after that extension was opened so that Riverside Drive traffic could go straight up and bypass Audubon Park if they wanted. You can also see there in the background that tower that's rising. That is the Manhattan side pier of the George Washington Bridge that was under construction at the time. Excuse me. So what happened now is that you've got these apartment buildings. In the meantime, between 1914 and 1928, apartment buildings were being built on the opposite side of Riverside Drive at the level of the drive. And the Audubon houses are now down in this sort of valley or pit between these two Riverside Drives. Um, I think I'm going to have a picture. Yes, here's a picture of the Audubon house up against Riverside Drive, and you can see that apartment building on the corner of Riverside and 155th back there behind it. It remained there for several years. There was community activism to try to save it. People realized its value. There was a historic preservation movement going on even then. People wanted to save it. However, they couldn't raise enough money to save it in place. There was a developer who bought the property, wanted to demolish it. At the last moment before he demolished it, funds did become available to move the house. And so it was moved up Riverside Drive, taken apart, moved up Riverside Drive to a new lot that the city donated for it. The plan was to rebuild it, restore it, use it for the Audubon Society and a nature museum. However, this was 1932. The Great Depression was deepening. Those plans never materialized, and the house succumbed to the elements, to souvenir seekers, and to vandals who just took the wood for various purposes. Time doesn't really permit my going into all of the details of what happened to the Audubon Park neighborhood between 1932 and the end of the 20th century when the movement began for the Audubon Park Historic District. But generally, it went through the same ups and downs that the rest of Manhattan did as far as the Great Depression, World War II, then the changes in urbanization of people moving out of the city in the 1950s. There was integration of the Audubon Park neighborhood, of what had been the Audubon Park neighborhood during the late 1950s and the 1960s. So what had been a very Eurocentric neighborhood became a multi-ethnic neighborhood, which it remains today. By 1987, when I moved to the neighborhood, the Audubon connection was long forgotten, despite the name still gracing Audubon Terrace, the museum complex, Audubon Avenue, the Audubon Ballroom, and many other designations. People just didn't really put that together. They just thought of it as the name, not as related to John James Audubon himself. After I'd lived in the neighborhood about 11 years, my partner Scott Robinson and I bought an apartment at the Grinnell, which you can see there. There are two different views of it. It's on a triangular block between Riverside Drive, 157th Street, and Edward M. Morgan Place, which is a remnant of that Boulevard Lafayette that I mentioned earlier. It's a very grand building. It's a built on a courtyard. There's a triangular courtyard in the middle of it, and it really does sort of make you begin to think about history. How did this building get here? What was here before it? What led to it? That was the beginning of my interest in neighborhood history, which quickly expanded from the Grinnell building itself into the neighborhood around it. And that's when I discovered that it had once been this Audubon Park neighborhood. And that began my 20-year journey of researching and sharing my findings through writing, website, presentations, and walking tours, and eventually the book that was published back in 2020. By chance, in late 1999, I learned that one of my neighbors at the Riviera, which is right next door, his name is John Esmond, was preparing a request for evaluation to the Landmarks Preservation Commission, asking them to designate an Audubon Park historic district. So I began working with John, contributing my research, helping him do additional research, preparing that request for evaluation. At that time, this was the early 2000s, I started using the evolving internet and social media to promote what we were doing. John submitted the RFE, the request for evaluation, in 2003, and in 2009, Landmarks Preservation Commission, LPC, designated the Audubon Park Historic District. That was an exceptionally fast turnaround for a designation. Often they take a decade or more before that happens. But you can see it outlined there on the left on the map. You have the Audubon Terrace Historic District, that's the museum complex. That was designated in 1979, so that 30 years between these designations. And then you have the Audubon Park Historic District, which was designated, as I said, in 2009. And on the right, you have some of the buildings, the Grinnell there in the middle, which you've already seen. You have Hispania Hall there on the lower part of the screen. And there on the upper part, you have 765 Riverside Drive. That sits on the site where Audubon's homestead once sat. However, about 20 feet higher because of the height of Riverside Drive at that part where it's built on the viaduct to take it through the old Audubon Park neighborhood. So underneath that is a double level garage underneath that building. And as you can see, it's a very interesting style. It was built later with different materials than these earlier Beaux-Arts apartment houses, but it reflects some of the same architectural interest in that. Look at the turret there at the top and the sort of crenellations there at the top make it look a bit like a fortress there on the corner of Riverside Drive. Now, once we got the historic district designated, our work was not really complete because LPC, Landmarks Preservation Commission, had omitted a key part of the original Audubon Park footprint, and that was this row of houses which sat on West 158th Street, the northern boundary of Audubon Park. In 2015, my neighbor Vivian Ducat, who is a activist preservationist and co-chair of a group called the Riverside Oval Association, understood or heard that some of the houses on the block were for sale and that a developer was interested in buying them. With a great deal of foresight, she realized the potential of using the air rights on those buildings to go up quite high to build a structure that would have been out of context with the apartment buildings and the museum complex already designated in the Audubon Park and Audubon Terrace historic districts. So she organized a group of people, like-minded preservationists, to try to get this designation of Audubon Park expanded to this row of houses. Despite assistance from our political leaders and the community board, and despite a groundswell of community support, and despite several requests for evaluation to uh, the LPC refused to designate this row either as a standalone historic district or as an extension of the existing Audubon Park historic district, sorry. As it turned out, our fears were not unfounded because a developer began accumulating houses and eventually secured 6 in the middle, most of which you can see, or several of which you can see in that picture on the lower right. Um, it took him about 10 years to accumulate all of those houses. And again, the fear was that he would demolish them and put up a building in their place, rather than, for example, combine them and use the vacant space behind them to extend them up maybe several stories. And I forgot to mention that behind these houses was an undeveloped lot. It had originally been a sort of community garden, but over time it had just become this undeveloped lot, and it went along with one of the houses in the middle of the row. So with those houses and that lot together, a developer had quite a bit of space that could be developed into a very tall building. Now, while all of this was going on, I began to work towards National Register designation for the historic district, the Audubon Park Historic District. But what we were after was something that would include these houses. Now, National Register status or designation does not give the same protection as Landmarks Preservation Commission. Landmarks Preservation Commission preserves the exterior of a building as it is at the time of designation. So anything done after that requires approval from LPC, and the building, except for extenuating circumstances, cannot be demolished. National Register status, even though it requires the same rigorous background and research as LPC requires, some of the same research, as a matter of fact, National Register status does not protect the building. It does, however, give the carrot approach, which is incentives for the owners of buildings to do improvements because they get tax credits for those improvements. However, someone who owns a building with National Register status can demolish it if they so desire, and they can make changes, but if they make the changes without the approval, they don't get the tax credits. So the LPC is really more of the hammer, and the National Register is more of the carrot approach. So we began working on this around 2018, I think it was. We had the assistance of a wonderful preservation specialist, Marissa Marvelli, who took the project over the finish line, and we received this designation in 2024 for a new National Register Audubon Park Historic District, which includes the Audubon Terrace Historic District, the Audubon Park Historic District, and these 12 houses on West 158th Street. Ironically, that same week, oh, sorry, before I get to that, I just had this one slide showing you some of our community activists in the Riverside Oval Association. They look after the oval there, which you can see in the center. That's in the center of Riverside Drive. They look after all sorts of other projects in the neighborhood. Again, this is co-chaired by a man named Steve Simons and Vivian Ducat, whom I mentioned a moment ago, as leading the preservation effort for West 158th Street. As I was saying, though, West 158th 58th Street, was included in that new Audubon Park Historic District, which was designated by the National Register in 2024. That very same week, the developer began demolishing the houses that he had bought and putting up this building that we feared would be placed there. The picture on the right is the older of the two. That's several months ago. You can see it rising above that row house, which is left next to it. The one on the left is the last couple of weeks, and now it is rising above the apartment house there on Riverside Drive, which is part of the Audubon Park Historic District. So you can see this building is going up, which is quite out of context with the existing architecture, all of the other buildings around it, which date from the early part of the 20th century. However, there's also the argument to be made that it is housing. However, it is probably, even though some units are put aside as affordable housing, it's debatable whether they would be affordable for people who are already living in the neighborhood. There's a whole formula used for calculating that. And most certainly, the apartments which are on the upper levels, which are going to have the spectacular view of the Hudson River and New Jersey Palisades and the George Washington Bridge, will not be among those that are going to be the most affordable. So my idea for a book about Audubon Park began back around 2000, back when I was doing those initial stages of research, when I was working with John Esmond on the Audubon Park Historic District request for evaluation. I had assembled enough research by that time to realize that this was a very interesting neighborhood, that it had taken an unusual path on its transition from forest land to farmland to suburb to cityscape. And so I began laying that out. And as I mentioned earlier, I sort of gained experience, gained an audience by a web presence, by doing presentations for various organizations, by doing walking tours, and just expanding my presence as a person who was interested in Audubon Park, which, again, with this developing internet during the early part of the 2000s, brought all sorts of people to me because they found me on the website and would say, oh, I had a great uncle who lived in Audubon Park and he wrote a reminiscence of it, and they might share that with me. The idea for this book evolved slowly, and the book itself, in part because I had a full-time job and had little time to spend in libraries or other institutions that had the resources that I needed to consult in order to write this book. Luckily, the internet was evolving while I was researching, and as the years passed, more and more resources became available online, with libraries and museums sharing their collections online. This meant, of course, that researchers like me, who had full-time jobs, could do their research any time of day when they had time available, or on the weekend, or any time, which really sped my research along. I would probably still be working on the book if that had not happened. And as I mentioned, with the connections on the internet, I became in touch with more and more people who had Audubon Park connections, photographs, memoirs, things that they were willing to share, letters that they were willing to share to help me with my research and to flesh out this book. Another lucky thing that happened at this time was a biographer named John Tolliver began working on his seminal biography of George Bird Grinnell, who you can see there in the upper right-hand side of the screen. George Bird Grinnell was son of George Blake Grinnell, whom I talked about earlier as a prime landholder in Audubon Park. As the eldest son, he really took control of the family when his parents died, and he was the one who really helped develop those exit strategy plans for leaving Audubon Park, even though it was bittersweet for him because given a choice, he really would have rather remained there until his death. However, he spent the last 2.5 decades of his life living elsewhere in Manhattan, in Lower Manhattan. Excuse me. John Tolliver, who was writing this book, was very generous with his research, which also accelerated my work, helped me to get it done so that I was able to get my manuscript completed and delivered to Fordham University Press, and the book was published in 2020. That is pretty much the end of my presentation.